Hello and welcome, everyone. So yeah, now I should do a little introduction. We are going to talk today first about art. We just learned it's called Monticello. So our very first architecture piece for this year. It's one of the things I really love about Decathlon is that it is not just paintings, right? Or even quilts and things that are flat and whatever. We also literally get architecture. And I have to tell you, I fell in love with art when I was in high school. We had to do a writing about an art piece, and I fell in love with it in 9th grade English when Ms. Miller made me write about a piece, and I picked The Bar at the Folies Bergère, which I now have a print of in my downstairs in my living. So from a 9th grade assignment, I have
Toulouse-Lautrec.
I have
gaslighting. I know this image.
There you go. There you go. And so when I got to Spain, as I've said, I aced my art history class because I knew, some art and some stories, and loved it. And I have to tell you that my daughter Nora is in Barcelona and loves her art history class, and just came back from a weekend where she went to the Prado and just amazing.
Neat.
I know. So I'm very excited for this piece, and then we'll take our break, and then we'll all take a deep breath and go learn about the Federalist 10. Turns out James Madison can't write any better.
I'm really thrilled to read Federalist 10. I've just been looking forward to this all weekend.
Hey, almost as good as Monticello. Almost.
Hey, can you spare a comma?
So close. I could spare 5,000 commas and I'd still have 10,000 too many. Yeah. All right. So on that note, Mr. Decker, you should be able to share. I will be womaning the chat and muting myself.
I like that. Womaning the chat. I like that. Okay. We're starting section 4 of the artwork, pages 82 through 93, Neoclassical Art and Architecture. So we've got a few paragraphs on the rise of neoclassicism in the US, which means we're going to have to talk about what's classicism, right? We can't understand neoclassicism without understanding classical antiquity. Aha. So neoclassicism is a renewed interest in antiquity during the late 18th century. And when we refer to antiquity, we're using a special time period. Like, you can't just say, oh, look, I have an antique mug here. Antique, we're not going to use in the general term. We're using a very specific term for antiquity. So whenever they talk about antiquity, especially in art terms, we're talking about ancient Greece and Rome. So really important to understand that. So when we talk about the classics and classical antiquity, we're talking about BCE times, right? Greece and Rome. And those were the heydays of Greece and Rome. Well, first Greece and then Rome and then Rome East, Constantinople and all that. A long time ago. And then we had this 1,000-year gap called the bubonic plague and the Black Death and the Dark Ages and whatever it is, however it is you want to call to them. And then we start coming out of that. And at some point during the timeline, we get reinterested in what the ancient Greeks and Romans were doing. Well, since we're not coming up with it brand new, we're doing it again. It's neoclassicism. So it's good old classical antiquity, but it's new classical antiquity, hence the neo in front of it. So I know, long-winded way of stating, we're looking at stuff that was really big a couple thousand years ago again. So neoclassicism as an art period movement going on in the late 1700s, and first in Europe, and then these ideals start spreading to America. And it's driven By archaeological excavations, mainly at Herculaneum and Pompeii. I've been to Pompeii, I'll never forget. I'm 7 years old, and it was striking to be walking around and seeing people not frozen in time, but ashed in time. There they are playing with a dog, these two little kids playing with a dog and covered in ash, and here's their, their form permanently in ash there. And it was striking, and it was striking to people at the time as they uncover these ancient cities. And so it was the reason why these particular places, why are we interested in this massive death strike from a volcano? Well, it's because it immediately covered everything up, and it completely preserved what life looked like at the time that it happened. And, for a lot of other ancient sites, well, people keep living in the ancient sites. You go see the Roman Colosseum. Well, people have been living from Rome ever since Rome became Rome. And so you've got these Roman ruins just down the street from brand new buildings that are being put up. And, so it's not, things have changed. All the houses my parents lived in their entire life, except for the one my mom is currently living in, they all no longer exist. I realized that the other day as I'm going through Google Earth, and I find that oh wow, when we live in things, we tend to tear down the old and build up the new, and we can't look at how things really look. So, long-winded way of saying, Herculaneum and Pompeii, those excavations gave everybody at the time, late 1700s, renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman antiquity. And what precipitated what we call the Grand Tour. And the Grand Tour, back in the day, if you were a male, upper class European in the late 1700s, you reached the age of 18, 19, you had money, you'd go on the Grand Tour, which means you go to London, you go to Paris, you go to Rome, several other major cities, but certainly those three. And you're getting this cultural education. It's like, okay, you've gone to school at home. Now you got to go and see all these different places. And first, upper class Europeans are doing it, and later on, upper class colonials are doing it. And later, when we became a country, Americans, we should say the United States of America, but I'll use what it says in the guide. So artists and architects are reviving these ideals that were originally expressed in Greco-Roman sculpture and architecture. Those ideals are encapsulated by the big three: balance, symmetry, harmony. If you want to understand more about this before I give a lecture on it, go and start reading section 1 of the Art Resource Guide. Covers all of this. Those of you who are non-seniors, the Art Resource Guide hasn't changed in the last 25 years that I've been doing this. So if you really, really know section 1, there's always going to be 10% of the questions on the art test directly from section 1. Really know it now, and that's one less section you have to learn for next year. So the Enlightenment emphasizes rationality. That's the whole idea that, hey, wow, instead of going based on tradition, I have a more enlightened outlook. I can actually think rationally about things. What a concept. Geometric order then becomes in vogue because geometry is very rational. You non-math people may not think so, but me being a math guy, yeah. So geometric order of neoclassicism becomes the visual expression to these philosophies. And later on, Jefferson is sort of got a fixation with one particular geometric shape. If any of you know it, you can type in this chat window now. No looking ahead. Neoclassicism in America carried important political associations for our early democracy. The United States did not have an extensive cultural history. We've talked about this. If you want to become an artist, you've got to go to Europe. If you want to become a musician, a composer, you got to go to Europe. Hard to stay in this country. There are no higher advanced places of learning. So we didn't have an extensive cultural history. Greek democracy and the Roman Republic became models for what an enlightened self-governance should look like. You know, what's it like to rule our own country and not just do what the king tells us to do? Well, let's what they do back in Greece, what they do back in Rome, because that's what they did. Emulation of antique architectural forms can create visual, symbolic associations with earlier cultures and the values they espoused. These would include liberty, civic virtue, idealism, and making sacrifices for the greater good. What a concept. Why would that be important in today's political climate? To think about that. So it's not just these values that are important, it's the fact that art and architecture are associated with certain values. So if we want to be associated with liberty, idealism, civic virtue, making sacrifices for the greater good, then we want to emulate cultures that did that, and we do that through their architecture. So here's this building. This is clearly not this despotic building that's based on this. It's Greek, or it's okay. You get the idea. Okay, so we get to one Thomas Jefferson, architect. Well, he wasn't just an architect, right? He was an author, he was a politician, he was a scientist, he was a lawyer, he was a farmer. His political career, of course, was extensive. He's born in Virginia in 1743, became a delegate to the Continental Congress, governor of Virginia, minister of France, secretary of state under Washington, vice president and president of the United States, served 2 terms as president of the United States. Quite the thing, but he liked to be known as an architect. There you go. Michelangelo liked to be named, thought of as a sculptor, which is why he really didn't like painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So certain people like to be known as certain things. Kind of interesting. So Jefferson's architectural projects included Monticello, which we'll be talking about, which he did in 2 stages, by the way. The first stage from 1769 to 1784. The second stage from 1796 to 1809. Okay? 40 years from beginning to end. He also designed the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond between 1785 and 96. And he, by the way, he designed it while ministered to the French court in Paris. And he copied a Roman temple from a temple, I put in an R there. He copied a Roman temple from 1st century BCE located in southern France. And he also designed the University of Virginia in Charlottesville from 1817 to 1826. This was after his 2 terms as president, and he designed them in his library in Monticello. The resource guide doesn't say that, but hey. He was very aware of architecture's symbolic potential. He wanted to turn away from the Georgian architecture that was favored in Britain at the time. He wanted to embrace Roman Republic as the model for government and architectural ideal. He was greatly influenced by a French architect by the name of Charles-Louis Clerisseau. Clerisseau was an ardent advocate for Neoclassicism in France, hence Jefferson's as well. Just a very cut off picture of Monticello. We will look at more of it. Again, designed in 2 stages covering 40 years. There was a gap in between. We had some kind of war going on, kind of caused some of that gap. 1769 to 1809, Charlottesville, Virginia. Monticello, Jefferson's home. It's Italian for little mountain, referring to the hill upon which it is built. So it's on top of a little hill. Neoclassical architecture, referencing ancient Greece and Rome. Design changed considerably over time. 40 years is a long time. He made alterations over that time, right? The first stage, 1768 to 1782, when Virginia was still a colony. This is pre-Revolutionary War. Jefferson was 25 years old, inherited all this from his father. He inherited 5,000 acres from his father. The second stage began in 1796 after the war, while he was serving as vice president to John Adams. Anyway, Jefferson inherited 5,000 acres from his father. He acquired 11,000 more throughout the years. So he had a total of 16,000 acres. I got my house on a quarter acre. Woohoo! Farming, several mills, a nailery, a textile operation, and of course, slave labor. We're going to come back to this link later because I've got some interesting things that I want to go over first. The influence of the English Palladian style is very present in this design of Monticello. The Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio, who published several landmark treatises on architecture. Palladio literally means wise one, okay? Wasn't his original name. His original name was something else, and then he worked with some other guy and he finally took this name. They're not going to test you on that, so I won't go into it, but if you want to click the link on Andrea Palladio, you can get his life story. It's quite interesting. Anyway, the Palladian style or Palladian style, we'll ask Miss Scully to get the A's down, was informed. When they use the word informed in this context, it means taking these ideas, these stylistic ideas, and creating it anew in this new building. So informed by, referenced from, however you want to say that. They usually in art say informed by, it's just the words they use. Informed by ancient Greek and Roman temples, relies heavily on symmetry. So Palladian style, symmetrical. 18th century British architects revived Palladio's ideas. Palladio lived in the 1500s, okay? 1508 to 1560 or 80 something. So it's the 16th century. So Palladio is neoclassical because he's looking at stuff from ancient Greece and Rome. And now here it is 200 years after that, and it's British architects, the reviving Palladio's neoclassicism. So if you really wanted to be redundant, this could be neoclassical, but it's just going to be neoclassical. It's really the, yeah, anyway. Jefferson did not want his estate to resemble a British country home. We're trying to split from Britain. So he likes this Palladio style, but he's going to make changes because if it looks too English, it kind of looks weird that he's trying to foment a split and then make your British. Yeah, okay, you get the idea. So he wants it to reflect classical ideals, but he doesn't want it to look British classic, right? So he makes changes. He places his house, Monticello, on top of a hill to gain a view of the surrounding Blue Ridge Mountains. This deviates from colonial convention of placing it your home near the edge of a river, which is what Washington did with Mount Vernon. In France, large one-story buildings were becoming really fashionable. So Jefferson changed the proportions of the main pavilion. We're going to look at it in a little bit, so that 2 stories would appear as one from the outside looking at it. And then he added a heavy Doric entablature around the building. We'll talk about this. If you read section 1 of the Art Resource Guide, page 14, they talk about the different types of columns, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and they talk about the base and the column and then the entablature around the top. And I'll point it out when we look at the actual artwork, the architecture in a moment, Monticello, but I'll point out this heavy Doric entablature around the building. He also added a 3rd story with a low dome near the front of the building, the northeast front of the building that you usually see on pictures. But if you look at it, it looks like one big 1-story house, and it's really a 2 to 3-story house if you include the dome, which a lot of people didn't use most of the time. We'll talk about that later. by compressing the 3 stories into the mountainside so that it appears to be a 1-story building. Upon first approach, Jefferson was able to project a particular narrative about himself as a self-sufficient, unassuming man of the Republic. These changes allowed the surrounding view to be unencumbered by the architecture. But very interesting when you think about this. This place, when you start going on the tour, we're going to go on a tour of the place in a minute. It's this amazing building. So you've built this amazing building that looks very opulent to me, and yet at the time, as President of the United States, this was telling a story, a narrative of him as being unassuming man of the Republic. So perception is everything. Hey, I'm just a regular guy with a mansion on 16,000 acres. Okay, so it's just kind of interesting. We're going to take a look at this in a little bit. A little bit more. I want to finish through the slides, then we're going to take the tour. Enter the octagon. Jefferson used the octagon and octagonal forms throughout Monticello. He used them as a design motif throughout the building. He cut them in half. He elongated them. He used the shape to form the dome that's on top. Palladio never used octagons. So again, more differences. Monticello built with a Virginia landscape at the forefront. He used local brick and wood. Yet he managed to display a wealth of different style reference points, from ancient Greece and Rome to British Palladianism to French neoclassicism. How very cosmopolitan of him. Now here's a nice little, right? You think, okay, that's what we're studying. That's in your art reproduction guide, your art reproduction booklet. Think, okay, this looks like a single story with really high ceilings, but this is actually 2 stories. And then this is just a dome on top. Here's the 3rd story. And it makes it kind of look like, well, this dome could be part of the entryway, so it just may be a really high ceiling. This all may just be a 1-story building. It's a 3-story building, and it's got a basement. And of course, the slave labor is in the kitchen in the basement. We're going to come back to this link in a moment. A little bit about that labor. The labor that allowed Monticello to operate and not be visible from the approach. Boy, I slaughtered the wordage here. Not to fix that. Labor that allowed Monticello to operate is not visible when you approach the home from looking at it from on front. The word facade, what it looks like on the outside. Okay. If you put on a facade, you put on a false front. Okay. There were more than 80 enslaved people working at Monticello at any given point in time. Over 600 enslaved people over Jefferson's lifetime worked as slaves for him. Slave quarters located behind and below the actual manor house, recessed into the hillside. So they're even underneath the mountain. Kitchen storerooms are all underneath the house. A series of dumbwaiters allowed the food and drink to be served from boxes on pulleys and revolving serving devices, hidden within cabinets and behind doors. This was Jefferson's. Now, they've had dumbwaiters, and I'm going to get into dumbwaiters in a little bit. I went down the rabbit hole of dumbwaiters. And the etymology and invention originated in ancient Greece, but he actually improved upon the ancient Greece versions, and we'll talk a little bit about this. These dumbwaiters gave Jefferson privacy during political discussions, and it masked the slave labor. In the Art Resource Guide, they put this right in there. Page 85. Isaac Granger was born a slave on Monticello, worked there as a nail maker, tinsmith, and blacksmith until he became free in the 1820s. So Jefferson wished to distinguish himself from the British monarchy and federalism of Adams' administration. Remember, in 1800, we had a peaceful transfer of power from Adams' Federalist Party to Jefferson's party, and we didn't have a revolution. We didn't say it was stolen. We said, okay, you win. Jefferson avoided top-down displays of authority. He forbid the use of his image on coins. He opened the White House to visitors. He would not have liked his image on any money, by the way. He opened the White House to visitors. He presented himself as a scientist, a farmer, an architect. But while he was doing this, he was perpetuating a system of inequality and exploitation within his own home, all while disguising the extent of his reliance on enslaved labor. Well, everybody who went there knew he had slaves. So I don't know if I would go this far, but this is what they say in the Art Resource Guide. It's not like he was keeping it hidden somehow. Everybody knew, but they do make the point that the same guy that said we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal had 80 slaves at any one point in time, 600 over his lifetime. Okay. He did have a lot of people working for him, and by all intents and purposes, it sounds like he was a pretty good boss, but he wasn't a boss, he was an owner. And that kind of changes the feeling there. A little bit about dumbwaiters before we go back and look at Monticello, because this was an interesting article. So there's a history of dumbwaiters, and I'll come down here to Jefferson's part in them. The first dumbwaiters date back to the ancient Greeks. And they talk about ancient Rome took the idea to the next level to move animals and gladiators to the fighting arena floor in the Colosseum via 24 lifts. So they had dumbwaiters in the Colosseum to move the animals and gladiators up and down. The men required to operate these lifts numbered in the hundreds. How Jefferson made these household helpers popular. In the 18th century, Thomas Jefferson, a Francophile, meaning he was into France and all things French, brought many innovations from France and the rest of Europe back to the United States. Among these was the French's use of dumbwaiters during dinner parties. By the way, in these times, dumbwaiter is one word. It used to be two words. We'll get into the etymology of that in a second. However, dumbwaiters adopted by Jefferson did not look anything like today's versions. Instead, these models were more of a portable serving stand. Hosts would replace their servants at dinner with these mobile stands that included all the foods for the many courses, from appetizers to desserts. In Paris, Jefferson could host up to 20 people with the help of 5 of these dumbwaiters. This piece of furniture may have remained as an archaic dining piece in Europe had Jefferson not brought the design back to the United States. At Jefferson's estate of Monticello, he had 5 dumbwaiters in his dining area. Among the dumbwaiters that Jefferson owned was a particular model that one guest described as a spring-loaded turning shelf between the kitchen and the dining room. The device allowed the kitchen staff to put food and beverages into the dumbwaiter, then turn it so that it would appear in the dining room for Jefferson and any of his guests. After the meal, the guests would put their empty plates on the dumbwaiter and it would revolve back into the kitchen. Jefferson employed such a model at the White House during his presidency as well. The use of the dumbwaiter as a state allowed Jefferson privacy and the chance to entertain his guests without servants distracting the meal. At the White House, the ability to host a meal without servants became a matter of national security. The president could discuss sensitive issues at meals with his guests without worrying about servants who may spread gossip about the discussions. With the Revolutionary War still in recent memory, along with the espionage that occurred during it, the nation's leaders had reason to fear open ears. The name for the dumbwaiter likely comes from its ability to act as a silent servant, using the outdated term dumb for someone who does not speak. Spinning shelves to move food between rooms was not the only dumbwaiter invention Jefferson made at his home in Monticello. He also had a lift mechanism to bring bottles of wine from his wine cellar to the floor above. The lift used weights and pulleys to move a load of wine from the basement up to the dining room. At the end of the meal, Jefferson could put the empty bottles back into the dumbwaiter, send them down to the cellar for reuse. If he had sent an empty bottle down during the meal, a member of his staff would likely replace it with a full bottle to return to the dining room. Though the first patent for dumbwaiters would not appear until the late 19th century, several homes of the well-to-do used variations of this device until then. They talk about Thomas Edison. I found this stuff fascinating. Though the mechanical dumbwaiter Jefferson used at Monticello was futuristic at the time, it didn't take off in popularity until the end of the 19th century, so 100 years later, when the first patent for a dumbwaiter appeared in 1887. Pulleys and weights. Very interesting. Very interesting. So I really don't think he was disguising slave labor so much as the fact that this allowed for more privacy in talking about political discussions. Based on what I've read, this tended to be more of the overriding concern. Going back a little bit, this link, really cool. This is Monticello.org. And I'll show you a little bit of the surrounding countries. Isn't that gorgeous? Remember, it's on 16,000. It's on top of a hill, 16,000 acres. Here are the vegetable gardens, spinning wheels, looms, study. It's pretty cool. So if you click on the menu, you see it's quite extensive, this website. And if you want to know more about Jefferson and slavery, the Statute for Religious Freedom, Declaration of Independence, all this stuff. One of our, I think it was 2003, the Decathlon theme was the Lewis and Clark expedition, which Jefferson.
It was 2003 to 2004 because it was the year I was pregnant with Glenn, and I wanted to name him Clark, and I was voted down.
Well, you could have gone for Merriweather.
I could have, or Sacagawea, who I can never call Sacagawea anymore because we were taught how to say one of the particles. Sacagawea.
Yes.
Wow. So it was the 2003 to 2004 year, and Glenn was born March 14, 2000. There you go.
There's lots of good stuff on this website. Lots of stuff on slavery, the plantation, people enslaved at Monticello, slavery FAQs, life of Sally Hemings, exploring. So, and this is the Monticello.org official website. So they don't back down from any delicate, stuff. I mean, they get into everything here. They've got videos. They've got the Jefferson Library. I mean, this is wonderful stuff. All these, the house, the gardens. I mean, we could spend several hours. I've already spent more than 2.5 hours going through just some of these here. And you can get tickets and tours and things like that. And you can go in person, but they have virtual tours. So, and now I'm trying to remember, what did I click on to do what I want to do next? Okay, let's see. Nope, that's not it.
There was one that said virtual tours of Monticello that was added on the lower left.
Yeah, see, that maybe that's it. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Wow, look at that. And you didn't even, I went on this and I don't even, I went too far afield.
I was just going to say, it's because I was just looking for what is it? Oh, look, if you can't bring your class to Monticello, we'll bring it to you.
Isn't that cool? So you could check that out. You can also go on the Google Street View tour, unguided. I decided to go on the 360 tour of Monticello, unguided. You guys should just explore, but I just wanted to take you on a few different places. It takes a while to load, and I have a fairly powerful computer. But
book a free Monticello field trip.
Yes.
Dude.
Yes.
Let's maybe, email them and see if they can do it. We might be able to. I
think that would be so cool. So just in looking at the different things, here's the exterior, which you have a copy of in your research. And what you have to realize is we're not studying the photograph of the exterior of Monticello. We're studying the entire Monticello. And of course, they're not going to ask near as many questions as what we can look at here, but I find this fascinating. So this is the east front. And if we can get rid of this, you can get different video. They'll give you a little introduction by clicking on the little, sound icons. And sometimes you can just, the enslaved community. If you click on, they were underneath here. So if you want to know more about them, they would tell you more about that. And they've actually got the names, and you can go through all this. Most of the bricks used to build the house were made on site in a brick kiln at the base of the mountain. Jefferson hired white workmen to work with enslaved laborers to make hundreds of thousands of bricks. Fingerprints and handprints from the workers can still be seen in the brick wall. I just found stuff like this fascinating. Jupiter, whose last name was probably Evans, was an enslaved stonecutter, hostler, coachman, and personal servant to Thomas Jefferson. He worked on the stone columns of the east portico, oversaw the operation of the stone stable on Mulberry Row. They're not going to test you on that. It's not in the art resource guide. But I just find the more you find out about this, the more it's going to stick in your head. So click on some of these things. Some of this stuff is in the art resource guide. In designing Monticello, Jefferson drew from several European sources, including classical Roman architecture, the writings of Italian and British neoclassical architects, and the newly constructed buildings he saw in France. That's all stuff that I just talked about. The east portico features stone columns in the Greek Doric style. Page 14, Art Resource Guide. The set of arched windows and arched glass doors are framed with decorative tan blocks that are actually pieces of wood that are sand painted to look like stone in a pattern derived from the work of a British architect. So this stuff that looks like stone here is actually wood, which I find fascinating. This up here, and see how we can zoom in and out. This is the entablature. So when it says the Doric entablature going around the building, that's this stuff. Okay. And there's just so many. There's a gong, a great clock, and we can go inside. You go on this. Now we're in the entrance hall, and they can talk all about this. This room highlighted Jefferson's wide-ranging interests and dedication to learning about the world around him. In this room, visitors viewed artifacts of American natural history, Western civilization, and American Indian cultures while they waited for a chance to greet the former president. Showcasing the objects in this room demonstrated Jefferson's belief that knowledge is power, knowledge is safety, knowledge is happiness, and that knowledge should be shared among the people in a democratic state. And what's neat, once you're in here, you can zoom in, you can zoom out, and you can get a feel for the whole place. And you can bust of Alexander Hamilton. Hey, you could go see a musical about him, and all sorts of fascinating things. And you can get a floor plan of the first floor. You say, oh, I want to check out the southeast piazza or the bedchamber or Jefferson's cabinet. And you can go right to those rooms and see some of these differences. And then you can go to the second floor and the third floor. You can go up to the dome room. I mean, it's really kind of cool. So I mean, we can try to schedule a tour. That would be really cool. I think we should try to do that. But also in the meantime, you can be going through this on your own. I find it fascinating. You can also go outside the building. You can go to the stable. The stone stable housed Jefferson's prized riding and carriage horses, as well as the occasional mule or milk cow. You can go to the greater plant. It's just fascinating stuff. I mean, you could spend hours looking at all this stuff here. So I just find it absolutely fascinating. You guys are probably, I'm probably boring you, but I find this stuff fascinating.
Not at all. Not at all. Although I definitely, I think that a tour might be cool just because they would, I think that they would also, yeah, like they would sort of walk us through in a pattern, I would imagine.
Yeah.
At which point you would, sort of just get that idea. And every time you get a real tour guide, they're like, oh, fun fact that
right.
Didn't know. Right. So we can see if we can do that. Maybe once school is in session, we can do it for us and whatever. That would be great. All right. Well, we'll look into that. It is 4:48 right now. Let's take an early break and come back right at 5. So let me pause the video and come back right at 5. I'm going to feed this cat because you can't see. Oh, here. There's a cat. And every time I put my arm like this, the cat bites, which is what's happening is the cat is like, you have not fed me dinner. And that thanks though, kitten. So I'm going to go feed the cat and I will be back at 5 and we will start and thank God finish Federalist 10. All right. Welcome back, everybody. We are resuming this. I'm sitting in a different chair right now because the cat did not want to eat. It just wanted my chair. So rather than fight with it and have it bite me, I'm now sitting in the different chair. Yeah, free to good home. Free to good. No, I'm just kidding. I love my cat, but he's annoying. All right. So when last we left our intrepid explorers here in, where's my literature section? Here we go. When last we left our Federalists, they were telling everybody that, hey, the Articles of Confederation are not working for us. We should discard them and take on the Constitution of the United States of America, which would, again, spoiler alert, this happens. So as we talked about, and in the song, they start writing, these 3 major Federalists start writing different essays, each one sort of saying, here's yet another reason to tell your legislature to vote for the Constitution. Most of us get away with a nice 3-paragraph essay, occasionally a 4, three body paragraphs, maybe 4 body paragraphs. Federalists end up with 85 full essays. So I guess it was a really hard sell. But we last time when we were meeting on Wednesday, we talked about the very first essay, which basically is the literary equivalent of, in this essay, I will tell you why you should vote for this stuff, written by one Alexander Hamilton, who, as we know, wrote 51 of the essays. This was the first, and then he wrote 50 more. John Jay writes 5. He actually writes 4, gets sick, and then 1 more. And then we have James Madison, who also writes papers. So we're going to now move over to the Literature Resource Guide, because the SOSI Resource Guide literally says, and they wrote the Federalist Papers. And so let's read them because they're part of our literature. And so let us do that. I think I may need to stop my share and try resharing again. Come, my child. Oh, I don't want to do that. I want to do this one. All right, it was trying to share itself. That did not work. All right, so here we are in the literature guide on page, God only knows, 87 of the literature guide. We just went over, this is the here's what I will talk about in this paper from Alexander Hamilton, Federalist 1, and it has a little analysis of Federalist 1, which you can read and we can review later. But by going through the actual piece, I think we hit all of these points. And then we are going to go, here is Federalist 10 by James Madison. So fun fact about Federalist 10 is it's probably, out of all of them, the paper that gets quoted the most nowadays. And it basically talks about the idea of factions. So people worried that, and possibly rightly so, that what they called in the 1780s factions, what we would call special interests in modern parlance, were really going to take over. So for example, you might have people who were farmers who wanted to enact policies that were very pro-farming. And the worry was that in a system of elected servers, people who were elected representatives, that a faction or a special interest like farming would get together and back a particular candidate or many candidates and get their agendas passed. And someone else might worry that this in the 1780s, the manufacturing sector would elect candidates who would then get their agendas passed, and so on and so forth. In modern days, of course, we have special interests, and people worry that the firearms lobby or the tobacco lobby or the pharmaceutical lobby are all getting agendas passed that are their particular ideas and priorities, and they are worried that that will come at the expense of other people and other groups, that the will of the general people. And Madison in Federalist 10 is going to make the point, sort of the purpose of Federalist 10, this paper, was to reassure people that in a society like ours, if you have a large enough democracy, and his idea that when he says kind of coast to coast, he's really kind of referring north to south, because remember, we don't go very far west at this point of American history. So his idea was sort of, look, you put the people up north close to Canada, what is now Canada, what's now Maine, all the way down to what's now Georgia, and will eventually be Florida and all of those things. You have so much diversity that no one faction and no one special interest, we would say, is going to be able to get enough ground to essentially take over. That the way to fight off this single-mindedness of purpose is to kind of open up the voting ideas to everyone. And let's put everyone in some major air quotes there, white landowners. But this idea that the more people you include, the less power any one clique might have. And the analogy might be made, although he doesn't make it obviously, to a high school. If you have a large enough high school, kind of there's room for lots and lots of different things. There's not just one club or one class or one group, one popular and one unpopular. There could be hundreds of different groupings and different organizations. So this is the purpose of Federalist paper number 10, written by James Madison. Only a month after the first one is written, this is November 23rd. Our first Federalist paper is in October. I think they said October 27th is the first one. So it is, within a month, and he's writing and he's going to say, hey, here's a fear that some of you may have and why it is actually not something you should be afraid of. So here's James Madison. And we'll go on to it. So I'll do the same thing I did last time, where I read a little bit and then I discuss it and read and discuss, and that will be what we cover today. So this was published in a different newspaper. Remember, most newspapers of the time were actually Federalist supporters themselves. The editorial boards were Federalist supporters themselves. So Federalist One is in the Independent Journal. These are papers that don't exist in New York City anymore. The second one was from something called the New York Packet. And it was published under, again, the name Publius, not under James Madison, although we give him credit now because we know that it was him. So hold on to your hats. Maybe grab some commas along the way. Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. So just real quick to get us started. So if you have a well-constructed country, a well-constructed union of states, the best thing about it, he starts off with, is that it stops violent factions, violent special interest groupings from forming and being able to take over, the tendency to break and control the violence of faction, the possibility that these factions will become violent. All right, I'm going to finish reading the paragraphs. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have, in truth, been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished, as they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamations. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired, but it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated, I can't believe he writes like this, that they have effectually obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected. So let's pause for a second here. We're like halfway through the first paragraph, and already I think that you can see this rhetoric is so advanced that I, who have a degree in American studies, am like, wow, what are you trying to say? And I don't want to imagine, I mean, I read Shakespeare more easily than this, and Shakespeare is older than this. So wow, you know, it's like this. So what he's saying is that people who like governments that are run by the people, so the people who are friends of popular governments, doesn't mean like popular, like, oh, hey, we're all so cool. It's popular governments, like governments that are run by the people, as opposed to, let's say, monarchies, which are not run by the people. That people who are supportive of these kinds of democratic societies are scared about the character of democratic societies and the fate of democratic societies when you think of what will happen or what could happen if a violent faction takes over. If you talk about their propensity or their likeliness to be attacked from within by these little factions, to be brought down by some little special interest groups. So he says he's got to make sure that whatever remedy he does, whatever democracy rules he puts in place in terms of like who can vote and how they can vote and who they're voting for and everything else, you've got to make sure that special factions cannot take over and ruin your government. And it's because if they do, popular governments have everywhere perished. In other words, it's the downfall of a democratic society if you let the minority take over and run the roost. And it's what people who are against democratic societies latch onto the most quickly. The adversaries of liberty are like, look, granted, this guy is a total schmo and he runs everything with an iron fist, but he's doing it for the good of the people rather than letting these crazy guys take over. Right. You know, at least we can, if we put in the right king, we'll have a good reign. Granted, maybe not, but you know, that's whatever. So look, he says, look, already America's done so much that's terrific. You know, we have these articles of Constitution that are, you know, that's great. The Articles of Confederacy, that's terrific, but it has not obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected. So take a pause for a second and remember that Shays' Rebellion has just happened. So there, he's like referring really obliquely to Shays' Rebellion. He's like, look, we said we were going to have a democratic government. We put in place the beginnings of a democratic society, right? We said we would all kind of work together as a whole and vote on, you know, with legislatures and have a Congress and things like that. But it didn't, we still had a rebellion of this small faction, which in this case was a debtors faction, right? People who owed debts and wanted the government to forgive the debts. And in Massachusetts, which was run by the merchants in Boston, those debts were not forgiven. People were jailed, their property was taken, and they rebelled against and remember, they were put down by a mercenary army that the merchants hired. And so obliquely, very kind of tangentially, James Madison is like, look, we have something in place that's okay, but it didn't stop Shays' rebellion. And James Madison is from Virginia, land of the slave states, hi, Monticello. And I'm sure in the back of his mind, it was like, fun fact, if the 500,000 enslaved people wanted to rise up and overthrow their owners, that might be a thing. That is a thing. So he says, look, everybody, there are people who are saying that our government is too unstable, that the general public good is forgotten because of these littler, the general good would be like, hey, let's pay off our debts, or let's forgive our debts, or whatever. But like, that didn't happen, and whatever. And the only way to control everything is by superior force and overbearing majority. The only way to put down Shays' rebellion kind of thing, he says, at this stage, with what we have, is an outside force kind of thing. So then he goes on. However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts, it's random commas that he's decided to put in, don't do that, children, will not permit us to deny that they are in some degrees true. It will be found, indeed, on a candid review of our situation, that some of the distresses under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments, but it will be found at the same time that other causes will not alone account for many of our heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights, which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other. These must chiefly, if not wholly, these must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. So he literally says over here that people blame the government and factions, and for not being able to handle this. But I'm saying that it will be found that we really, the worst problems are not entirely from the government, but for not only worrying about how they interact with all members of the public, but our fear for the rights of the individual. And if you remember from like the lecture from last time, people were so scared of losing their individual freedoms that when the Constitution gets passed, the Bill of Rights is amended to it and gets passed right along with it. Those first 10 amendments, freedom of speech, freedom to congregate, freedom from religion, freedom of assembly, the right to not incriminate yourself in a jury trial, all those first 10 amendments, they are like, oh yeah, people have rights too. Individual rights will be guaranteed by the Constitution doesn't just govern the big picture government, it also guarantees us individual rights. So he's saying, I know there are issues. So hang on and let me tell you why we can all calm down. Okay. So now he's going to define what a faction is. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So this is his way of defining a faction. It is either a majority of people or a group, a minority of the whole, who are united by some passion, some interest. Either they are fighting for the rights of other citizens or against the rights of other citizens, or for their own permanent interests of their community. And he is even talking about like maybe the Georgia or South Carolina or whatever, like the rights of the South Carolinians over everybody else. It's not just farmers or debtors. It's also like my state's rights over everybody else's. So he's like, look, there are two ways to deal with factions. There are two methods of curing the mischiefs of factions. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. And this is a very famous statement that he's made. He's like, look, we can either deal with factions by getting rid of the reason that people form them in the first place, or we can just control the effects, like not letting them get what they want, even though they're going to want it and they're going to vote together as a block, will stop the effects. So cause and effect. So there again, he's going to talk about how to deal with the causes, like how to get rid of the causes of factions. There are, again, two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one, by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other, by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. So he speaks pretty bluntly here, although you maybe can't tell. He says, look, in order to prevent people from grouping up together, number one is you could, if you wanted to, just remove their ability to group up. If they have no rights, they can't decide what they want to vote in. If you are talking about a country with a very repressive regime who is in charge and no one has the right to freedom of speech, no one has the right to congregate, no one has the right to protest, they can't form an some government faction, because if you didn't have Shay gathering up all his friends to fight against this rebellion, if you could just take him out and shoot him in the back, no Shay's rebellion. He's like, the other way to do it is just to kind of big brother everybody. This is way before George Orwell wrote 1984, because that was in 1948 that he wrote it. But basically to like brainwash everybody to all have the same passions and the same ideas, and yes, we will do this thing together. Yes, whatever. So now he's going to be like, these are why both of those options really are terrible. Right. One is to get rid of liberty, and the other one, and not let anybody have an opinion. And the other one is to make everybody have the same opinion. So this is what he says. He's like, that's terrible ideas. First of all, he says, it could never be more truly said than of the first remedy, it was worse than the disease. The worse even than having factions take over is to not allow them to form by taking away all their rights and all their liberties. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. If you take away liberty on the theory that it gets rid of factions, you'll kill political life. It's just like if you took away air because it feeds a fire, you'd kill all animals on the planet. It's the cure would be worse than the disease. The second expedient is as impractical as the first would be unwise. The second expedient is up here, this idea that we should give every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. That's one way to get rid of factions. And he's like, that's a second dumb idea, don't do that. The second expedient, he says, like this is equally dumb, is as impracticable as it would be unwise, as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, as long as people can fail and are human, as long as people don't always make the right decision, he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love is taking care of himself, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. His reason will temper his love of himself, and his love of himself will temper, the head, the heart, the head. And the former will be objects to which the latter will attach himself. The reason will be ways that his self-love will attach itself to. The diversity of the faculties of men, the difference in brains, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interests. Everybody thinks differently, so we'll never have the same uniformity of interests. Everybody won't agree with each other. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results. And from the influence on these, on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors, ensures a division of the society into different interests and parties. And interestingly, what he's saying here is you have the rich and the poor, and the rich will protect their rich people interests, and the poor will protect their poor people interests, which will be different by necessity from the rich people interests. And we can't all agree on this. And it's going to be property, which sort of, stratas us out and keeps us from all being one mindless robotic way of thinking, which is especially interesting for Virginian, where people are property. I mean, you could really get into this in a great essay that might be there. I'm looking at the chat a little bit. What an interesting take. It is an interesting take. If only it was written in English, it would be an even more interesting take. Okay, here we are. The latent causes of faction, why we split in factions, are thus sewn into the nature of man. And we see them everywhere, brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, concerning many other points, as well as speculation and of practice, an attachment to different leaders, ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful of distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common, okay, so let me stop there for 1 second. Basically, this is like, they'll fight about anything. And if you have siblings, you're sitting there going like hashtag facts right now. People fight about, right, anything. They're the team that they support, that not just politicians, but literally people. I like this person, I like that person, I want religion, property, whatever it is, right? But I mean, literally you try to get like, Dodgers and Angels, sports fans next to each other, they'll fight over each other. And he's like, look, factions are natural. It just happens in the human condition. Okay, over here. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessity and ordinary operations of the government. So he's like, look, of all the fights we could have, it's about money. He calls it property, but he really means class. It's a class-filled society. Those who are creditors and debtors, remember Shays' Rebellion is right at the forefront of everybody's memory here. But there's also people with land, people who are in manufacturing, like factory owners, people who are merchants and mercantile, that would be like, people who would sell things, or a silversmith or whatever, people who lend money, the banks, the whatever, and then everybody who doesn't have any of that stuff. That just divides them into different groups, and they're all fighting for their rights and their opinions to be heard. He's not talking about voting yet, Paul Imam. I think he's really just talking about how factions arise rather than who literally gets the vote. Because remember, we haven't decided who gets the vote yet. All right, so moving on, we're not quite almost done, but I'll go a little faster. Okay, I think we're getting more what's going on now. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause because his interest would certainly bias his judgment and, not improbably, corrupt his integrity. With equal, nay, greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet what are many of the most important acts of legislation, but so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens. And what are the different classes of legislators but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine? So he's like, look, nobody can be their own judge and jury. They would find in favor of themselves. That's, ethically unbiased. But if you elect legislators, they are by necessity voting on laws and things that affect them because they are citizens, they are merchants, they are manufacturers, they are property owners. And now we're asking them to vote on things that benefit themselves. So how does that work? He says, basically. Is a law proposed concerning private debts? Remember, Shades of Brilliant right there. It is a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors are on the other. Justice ought to hold the balance between them. Yet the parties are and must be themselves the judges. And the most numerous party, or in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. What's going to happen is that the majority is going to win and they're going to find in their own favor because that's how that works. Shall domestic manufacturers be encouraged, and in what degree, by restrictions on foreign manufacturers? Are questions which would be differently decided by the landed and the manufacturing classes, and probably by neither, with a sole regard to justice and the public good. If you're trying to decide about restricting imports, the merchants, the American merchants are going to vote one way, and the people who are salespeople are going to vote a different way, and nobody's going to be voting on what's best for the public. They're just going to be voting on what's best for themselves. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality, and yet there is perhaps no legislative act in which the greater opportunity and temptation are given to the predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved to their own pockets. I like you, Madison. You just took a while to get there. Okay, it is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, nor in many cases can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of the whole. Look, first of all, we won't always elect smart people, he says. And second of all, it's really hard to think impartially about like people who are farther away when the close interests are the ones begging for our attention. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of factions cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. So we can't stop people from it. We don't want to take away their liberty, and we can't stop them from forming factions in the first place. We can't control the causes of factions. So the only thing left for us to do if we're going to design a government is to limit the effects. There are going to be factions. How do we limit the negative effects of factions on our government? So here's his solution to them. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, the democratic principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. So if the faction is a minority, they'll just get outvoted by the majority. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. So if you have a minority, it'll snare things up for a while, but it'll prevail as long as it's not the majority of people who want it. We'll be okay because we'll just have a 3-2 vote and it'll go away. When a majority is included in a faction, when the faction is more than half the people, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice its ruling passion or interest, both the public good and the rights of other citizens. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Let me add that it is the great desideratum by which this form of government can be rescued from the opprobrium under which it has so long labored, and be recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. So this is the heart of what he's saying. Okay, if it's a minority, don't worry, the majority will vote it out. The major issue with a Republican or democratic society, the way we think of the word democratic, meaning to vote for things, is what happens when you get a majority of people voting in a way that hurts everybody else. What happens when it's not some random little fringe group, but actually 51% of the American people are voting for something that is a terrible thing? To keep it apolitical in modern times, let's talk about the idea of like slavery. Like, you know, they were voting to keep down this huge population. So how do you deal with this? He says, and he says in this right here, I have a solution, and I'm going to tell you that this Constitution is the way to go because it controls for factions in a society by controlling the effects of those factions can have on society. 536, we got it, fam. By what means is this object attainable? Evidently by one of two ways only. Either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. So we either need to keep all of them from agreeing with each other, or if they're in the majority, they have to be able to not enact what they want to do in hurting other people. So either we got to keep them from being a majority altogether, or they just can't make it happen. Like something's going to have to get in their way to stop them from voting to hurt everybody else. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. They are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals, and they lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together. That is, in proportion as their efficacy becomes needful. So we can't count on moral, like people won't say like, well, that's not nice, that's not right. And even religion, they won't listen. And the larger the group agitating, you know, for whatever hurtful thing it is, the less people are going to turn to morality and religion to try to be the guiding principle of justice here. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a very small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischief of factions. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. And he says, look, if we look at what he calls a pure democracy, which we think that we have here in America, but James Madison is going to make a distinction. He defines a pure democracy as a society that has a very small number of citizens who work within the government. That is what a true democracy is. Basically, a small group of people who run the whole government for the big group of people. And he says, if you have a true democracy that is like a small number of people, everybody's going to be convinced to do whatever it is that they're going to do, and justice will not be served and people will get hurt from it. Hence it is, he says, that historically such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. And if you have read George Orwell's book, Animal Farm, that's the idea of a pure democracy. Animal Farm, again, written 200 years after this was written, 150 years after this was written. But the idea is a small group of pigs decided that they would take over the farm and decide what would work for the good of the animals. And we all know that, or if you've read, spoiler alert, it doesn't work out so well for all the animals on the farm, because a small group just puts themselves ahead of, and it sort of all goes. So he's like, look, a quote unquote democracy is not a good plan. And now he's going to be like, but that's not what the Constitution is going to promise us. We're actually not going to be a democracy. We're going to be a republic. And this is why a republic will work better. A republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let's examine the points in which it varies from a pure democracy, and we will comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. So here's what I'm talking about, not a democracy, a republic. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government, in the latter, to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. So in a republic, you have a small number of people who govern, but they're elected by everybody. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. So he's like, look, we're going to elect a small government, but we're going to open up voting to as many people as possible. And by doing it that, so the pigs and Animal Farm elect themselves to run the government. In a republic, which is what the United States of America technically is, although we call it a democracy, we are actually not true. We are in fact a republic. Everybody has a right to vote, and I'm going to put everybody really in some air quotes because that everybody had to be expanded over the years, right? First people of color, then to women, and whatever. Okay, so we've expanded that definition. We all know how I feel about that. But the idea is, if you get enough people voting, you won't be able to form a faction because everybody's going to vote differently, and the small number of legislators are going to have to answer to this huge number of their constituents. That's his idea. The effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. We're going to elect good people because it's going to, we're going to vote for that small number of people, and we're going to pick good people to run. Keep your opinions about what actually happens to yourself, but that's the idea. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for the purposes. It may be that if we do this election this way, the people we elect will be pro for the public to everybody. On the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister designs may, by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means, first obtain their suffrages, and then and then betray the interests of their people. So we might elect good people, or we might have people who get elected by hook or by crook or by graft or by, cheating or whatever, and then get elected and then vote, their own don't vote their own way and ignore the people. The question resulting is whether small or extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public weal, and it is clearly decided in favor of the latter. by two obvious considerations. So he's like, look, should we have a small number of voting public people or a large number of voting public people? And he's like, the answer is clear. We need a large voting body, as many people voting as possible. In the first place, it is to be remarked that however small the republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number in order to guard against the cabals of a few, and that however large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. Hence, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the two constituents, and being proportionally greater in the small republic, it follows that if the proportion of fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will present a greater option and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice. Okay, when I posted about this on Facebook, I included a whole like Marx Brothers bit where it was like, oh my God, whatever. Yeah, Marine, for sure, this is like that stuff. Okay, so what he says is like, if we have a small number of voters and they elect a small number of people, the 1-to-1 ratio, it's going to be like more, it's going to have a larger effect, right? Like 3 people voting for something out of 4 is 75%. 3 people voting for something out of 100 is only 3%, right? So if you have a large enough body, you kind of dilute their power by having a larger body. He's like, but on the other hand, you can't have too many people, because then nobody's going to listen to anybody and everyone's going to talk to each other, right? We have no public address system, no microphone or anything like that. But that's his idea. Like if you have only 10 people in a room and 8 of them are voting for something, you have an 80% majority. If you have 100 people in the room and 8 people vote for it, you have only 8% supporting it, right? So he's like, okay, look, we have to have the Constitution is going to provide, and right, this is the idea, this Connecticut Compromise is 2 houses. There's the House of Representatives, which has 427 people in it now, where each little, part, we have people representing all over California. I think we have 42 representatives or whatever. And then you have the Senate, which is only 100, right? It's 2 from each state. I mean, in our time, it's 100 because we have 50 states, but in their time, it was 26 because they had 13. In the next place, each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, and it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried. And the suffrages of the people being more free, it will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffuse and established characters. In other words, if you have to convince 100,000 people to vote for you, you'll probably, really interesting to say this in this political climate, but you will probably be at least interesting to a larger number of people. You could be really niche, but then you wouldn't get as many votes, and you have to convince everybody. You have to be his idea, Madison's idea, is that you have to be kind of a centrist in order to win. That's his idea. It must be confessed that in this, as in most other cases, there is a mean on both sides of which inconveniences will be found to lie. By enlarging too much the number of electors, you render the representatives too little acquainted with all their local circumstances and lesser interests. As by reducing it too much, you render him unduly attached to those and too little fit to comprehend and pursue great and national objects. The federal Constitution forms a happy combination in this respect, the great and aggregate interests being referred to the national, the local, and particular to the state legislatures. Fact. In other words, look, our new Constitution has the right number of people elected. You have a big enough constituency so that you see the big picture stuff. You have a small enough constituency so that you know what to fight for more often. We're almost there. The other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and the greater extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of the Republican than of the Democratic government. And it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. So look, if we can get more people into a republic than in a democracy, we're better off. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will the majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. It's really fascinating to read this. When Madison wrote this, there were no political parties. And we have devolved, I'm sure you've heard this argument, into a true two-party system. There's only the Republicans and the Democrats. There are other parties that exist, the Green Party, the Independent Party, the Communist Party. You're allowed to be any other party, but we have, for all intents and purposes, become an entirely two-party system of government. And exactly what Madison was afraid of has in fact come to pass, that frequently it's either, it's whoever's in charge of, let's say, the House of Representatives. So it's the Democrats right now, it'll be the Republicans later. That's the agenda that we run with as a country, where there's not 15 other parties like there are right now in England, stuff like that, and India, which is based on England's ideas. Extend that sphere and you take in Aidan, extend that sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that the majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked that where there is consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. If you get enough people in the room, nobody's going to be able to agree with each other, he says. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, and is enjoyed by the union over the states composing it. We will be better off if, instead of just being from Virginia, we are all the states together, because that will open up the number of voters. It will decrease the number of factions because Virginia has its own special interests, and it will be better for us not to be the nation of Virginia, but to be the nation of the United States with Virginia as one faction to it. Does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudices and schemes of injustice? It will not be denied that the representation of the union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments. If you're going to go for national government, you're going to be better than the local people, he says. Does it consist in the greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? In an equal degree, does the increased variety of parties comprised within the union increase the security? Does it, in fine, consist in the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested minority? Here again, the extent of the union gives it the most palpable advantage. The bigger the number of people we admit into the union, the more naturally factions will be controlled, not by any outside force, but because there are just too many factions to that, like, they'll all just be fighting each other. They will keep each other in check, he says, and this is how he ends it. And this idea of the flame and these analogies are very, very important and very powerful. So, thank you, Aidan. I'll go look at it afterwards, and Jack put one up too. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration to the other states. Wow, that did not work well. I'll have to highlight it from down here. The influence, let me read that again because it's such an important line. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame in their particular states, but that flame will be unable to spread a general conflagration, giant fire, to the other states. A religious sect may denigrate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper and wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than any particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular country or district than an entire state. So he was sitting there saying, look at what a rage for paper money, which of course we now have. We don't have a gold standard. For an abolition of debts. See, again, he hated the Shays Rebellion. For an equal division of property. Don't take away my property and give it to other people. Or for any other improper or wicked project. It might be somebody's agenda, but it's not going to be the agenda of the whole Union, he says. In the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican, meaning a way of voting, remedy for the diseases most incident to the Republican government. We're going to use the Republican form of governing ourselves, and that will cure all the issues that come up in a society that governs itself. And according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of Federalists. So eventually Hamilton and Madison are going to hate each other, but for right now, they're really worried about, they're agreeing with each other. They worry about the danger of a popular government. They both say that human conflict is inevitable. They say people will disagree about religion and politics and different economic interests. As long as they have the liberty to agree with, to say their piece, there will be disagreements. So he says we can't cure factions, we can't stop them from forming. So we have to show how the Constitution will control the effects of factions. First of all, you can't have a tyranny of the minority. You can't have the minority taking over because the majority will just vote them out. He's like, look, that's fine. So instead he says, look, the balance is found in the structure of government, because sometimes you'll have bad leaders at the helm. It is for Madison, the government structure designed by the Constitution is ideal because it is a representative democracy. That's what he's calling a republic that is spread over a large amount of territory. So there you have it. And we have now read the two pieces. If you look at the SOSI guide, we did this because, hold on one moment as it loads, we are towards the end of section 3, where we are talking about the Federalist Papers. It's not coming up on my screen, but that it may be. We are on page 55, essentially. And on Wednesday, we will talk about essentially, it's not working here. Thank you. Sorry. On Wednesday, we will essentially talk about what happens at the end of this, the passage of this, and the governments that follow, because essentially George Washington is going to be elected as our first president. And then I don't know how far we will get, but my hope is really to finish section 3 by the end of next week. We'll see if we can do that. I don't know. It's about 10 pages, but we have 3 days to do it. So on that note, it is just about 6 p.m. I'm going to stop the recording. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in a chat or unmute. Otherwise, it is Monday the 18th, and we will see you on Wednesday the 20th.